Hello, everyone, and welcome to our overview of the NCUA's new succession planning rule. My name is Alyssa Pugh, and I am so excited to be here with you today. Before we get started, I do have just a quick disclaimer. This presentation is for information only. It contains my own opinions, and it is proprietary. A few housekeeping items. This session does have audio and video. So if all you can see is the PowerPoint, well, you'll still get the same great information, just not my face. At the end of the session, give us your feedback and you might just win a $25 Amazon gift card. The slides, recording, and certificate of attendance will be sent to you via email after the session. And finally, please interact with us today. Go ahead and use that questions panel and GoToWebinar. We do have over 400 people registered, so we will try to get to as many questions as we can. And we are so grateful to have you joining us today. This webinar is hosted by Tandem, a governance, risk management, and compliance application by Conetrix. We help businesses like yours manage and improve their security and resilience with our suite of web applications for business continuity planning, vendor management, incident management, and more. So enough about me. I would also love to get to know you. I have a couple quick poll questions throughout our session today, and I would love for you to participate because I know everybody else on the call would as well. I'm a big believer that we learn best when we can all learn together and learn from each other. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this first poll question here. Bear with me just a second. The first question we have is, what type of organization do you currently work for? Our answer options here are credit union, other financial institutions, so banks, mortgage companies, trust companies, things like that. Third-party service providers such as consultants or MSPs, a regulatory agency, or other. And if you choose other, go ahead, leave us a comment. Let us know where you're from. All right, we've got about 3/4 of our attendees who have voted. So I'm going to close that poll and share those results with you. And about what I'd expect, 87% of our attendees today are from a credit union, and then on down from there. So 5% each on other financial institution and third-party service provider. And we've got some others here with us today too. So wherever you are from, thank you so much for being here. And I hope to have something for you guys today. All right, I do have one more poll question for you. This one specifically for my credit unions on the call today, and that is, what is your credit union's asset size? So I'm going to launch that poll. We have options here of less than 100 million, 100 to 500 million, 500 million to $1 billion, 1 billion to 5 billion, and more than 5 billion. So I'll give you all just a couple seconds to fill that out. This one's always interesting to me. I never know who's going to answer what on this one, so it's always good to see, what our demographics are for the day. Okay, I'm going to close that and share those results with you as well. So it looks like most of us are either in the 100 million to 500 million range or the 1 billion to 5 billion range. So that's about what I'd expect. A lot of community credit unions on the call today. I love to see that. And again, I hope that this is going to be super helpful for all of you. All right, for our agenda today, we are going to be walking through an overview of the rule. Then I want to spend some time looking at the existing guidelines around succession planning and talking about how this rule is different. We'll then do a deep dive into the succession planning requirements. And this isn't our first rodeo, so I want to share with you a few best practices and lessons learned. And then at the end, we are going to do a wrap up with some resources to help you with your succession plan. As always, you are welcome to submit questions that you have. I'll be building in some time to answer those as we go along today. So let's get started. Our first section of the day is going to be providing you guys with an overview of the rule. So what are we even talking about and why are we here? So the title of this rule gets right to the point. It's actually just called succession planning. So you know exactly what you're getting into with this one. This rule has been in the works for a while. So it was first published in the Federal Register 3 years ago, so February of 2022. It had a revision in July of last year and it was finalized in December. It is set to go into effect on January 1st, 2026. So nothing says Happy New Year quite like a resolution to update your succession plans. If you would like to follow along with us today, you can get a copy of the rule from the Federal Register. So I'm going to ask our team to drop a link to that into the chat for you guys so you can get that. The link will also be in the slides, which you will receive after the session. And if you got the email from me yesterday, we've got a link to that in there as well. Before we get there, though, I want to answer the question, who does the rule apply to? First, this rule applies to all federally insured credit unions, including all federal credit unions and federally insured state chartered credit unions. Now, there was some question about if the state chartered credit unions would be included in this rule because some states already have succession planning requirements, but the final rule says, yes, you guys too. And if there's any conflict between the two, which there really shouldn't be, but if there is, go ahead and defer to the state's requirements. This rule also applies to credit unions of all asset sizes, including small credit unions. Now, there was some question about if small credit unions might be excluded from the requirements, but the proposed rule said that smaller credit unions may be most likely to benefit from this rule. So if you work for a small credit union, this rule does apply to you too. But the NCUA has provided some nifty tools and guidance which can help you create your succession plan. More on that in a bit. Now, for our non-credit unions on the call, I have actually had a couple of questions on this, so I want to go ahead and acknowledge this rule does not apply to other types of financial institutions, and there's nothing really comparable for it for community banks right now. The other agencies have published guidance on the matter. The FDIC had a proposed rule in 2023 that would apply to banks with over $10 billion in assets, but we're really still waiting to see what happens next with that. And the other agencies, the Federal Reserve, the OCC, they do have some corporate governance rules which address succession planning, but those only apply to very large banks. So again, as of today, there are no rules like this for community banks. But if you're from a non-credit union and you're joining us today, welcome to you as well. Even if this doesn't legally apply to you, we are still going to be covering some helpful topics. So feel free to stick around and learn with us about succession planning. I think the other big question that people are asking right now is why? Why did the NCUA decide to publish this new rule? Well, the NCUA actually gave us a few reasons in their commentary on the rule. First is the retirement of the baby boomer generation, which would be individuals born between 1946 and 1964. So like roughly 60 to 80-year-olds right now. So in the rule, the NCUA cited a source that said approximately 10% of credit union executives were expected to retire between 2019 and 2021. Personally, this is where those disclaimers start to come in. I think this is an interesting reason to give. You know, generations tend to come and go in the workforce. The primary reason I can think that baby boomers made it onto the NCUA's radar is because of the size of that generation and their current status in credit union leadership roles. But I think it's also worth noting that a lot of studies have shown that a significant portion of the baby boomer generation plans to continue working beyond retirement age. Some out of necessity, but some out of finding value, some out of finding a sense of purpose, some out of finding satisfaction in their work and more flexible work arrangements. So I think that this point is worth noting, but as far as all of the reasons go for this new rule, I don't think that this one has the strongest legs to stand on. Now, the second and much more interesting reason the NCUA gave was that credit unions have been consolidating due to a lack of succession planning. So this is like mergers and acquisitions. And before I spill the tea on this, since we have a lot of credit unions on the call today, I'd love to ask you. So I've got a poll question here. If your credit union was involved with a merger or acquisition, was succession planning a factor? So I'm going to launch that. And our answer options here are, yes, we previously consolidated and it was a factor. Yes, we're currently consolidating and it has been a factor. No, we previously consolidated and it was not a factor. No, we have not gone through a consolidation. And the last one is not applicable or unknown. So I will give you all a few more minutes to respond. I say minutes, I just mean seconds. We're not going to wait here for forever. All right. We've got about 65% voted. So I'll give you just like, I'm going to count down from 5 and then I'm going to close that. 5, 4, 3, 2. Okay. sharing those results. About half said no, we have not gone through a consolidation. About a quarter said not applicable or unknown. But then we're kind of more close on the yeses and nos. So that's really interesting to see. But only 13% of attendees today have said that you previously consolidated or are consolidating and it's currently a factor. So thank you for sharing. I think that's really interesting data because of what the NCUA shared. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to that now. In 2014, the NCUA published a study called Truth in Mergers. And this report basically said that 32% of credit union consolidations were due to poor management succession planning. And the NCUA cited this study in their commentary on the rule. Suffice it to say, eyebrows were raised, right? Commenters on the proposed rule raised questions about the study's age, about the fact that parts of the study were conducted during the financial crisis of 2008, and about the fact that credit union consolidation is a viable business strategy regardless of the reasons. The NCUA's response was that aside from the data, this is really a safety and soundness issue. So the rule commentary states that, I'm just going to read this here, so let me get that up. The failure of federally insured credit unions, or FICUs, to adequately plan for succession poses a risk not only to individual FICUs and their member owners, but to the credit union system as a whole and to the share insurance fund. So in short, everything else is kind of a moot point, right? The NCUA has the authority and the responsibility to ensure the safety and soundness of the credit union system. And since they've identified succession planning as a potential pitfall in this area, this alone is really compelling enough reason for this rule. That said, one reason the NCUA didn't mention in their rule, but I think is equally and potentially more compelling, is current events involving leadership turnover and highlighting the need for succession planning. Did you know that in 2024, so last year, a record number of CEOs resigned due to pressure from investors? That's across all industries, but it's kind of a big deal and it's definitely worth noting in this conversation. 2024 also brought us the tragic event involving United Healthcare's CEO. And while that's 100% an edge case, again, it's worth noting as part of this conversation. On a more lighthearted note, we also saw the historic coronation of King Charles in 2023. Nothing says let's talk about succession planning like season 3 of The Crown, right? Okay, I bring all of this up because I think it's incredibly important for setting the stage for our conversation today. And I also think it's important because when it comes to sensitive topics like succession planning, the more data you have, the better. To sum it all up, the key takeaway I want you to have from this section is this. The primary reason we have this new rule is because the NCUA believes a heightened focus on succession planning is needed and it will improve the safety and soundness of the credit union system. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and just give you guys a quick reminder that if you have any questions, any thoughts, observations, or comments, or if you just want to chat with me, I'd love to hear from you all. So feel free to drop a note into our chat box. Okay, so succession planning is important, but isn't it already required? Let's find out. Before I get into this section, I do want to go ahead and launch another quick poll. Does your credit union already have a succession plan of some sort? I'm going to go ahead and launch that, and we've just got 3 simple answers here. We've got yes, no, or not applicable / unknown. So I will give you all just a couple seconds here. And when I say couple seconds, I mean it. Most of you guys have already voted, so I'm going to close that and share that. 80% said yes, 5% said no, and 15% said not applicable or unknown. So that's great. I am not surprised by that number at all. And I am glad to see that what we're talking about today is how are we going to update our succession plans mostly rather than starting from ground zero. So let's see what the existing guidelines have to say. Up first is that for credit unions, there are currently 2 regulations which allude to succession planning. The first is 12 CFR Part 704, which basically requires federally insured corporate credit union boards to ensure cross-training for certain personnel. And the other is 12 CFR Part 749 Appendix B, which requires all credit unions to prepare for catastrophic acts. So while many credit unions already perform some level of succession planning as part of complying with these requirements, neither of these regulations explicitly say do succession planning. From a guidance perspective, we're going to look to the FFIEC IT Examination Handbook, and in particular, there are two booklets here which talk about succession planning. So the first is the Business Continuity Management booklet, and it states that management oversight should include, I'm just going to read this again, defining BCM roles, responsibilities, and succession plans, and that exercise and test plans generally include identification of decision makers and succession plans. So we've got some succession planning there from a business continuity perspective. The other booklet that I want to mention is the management booklet. And this one goes into a bit more detail. I'm not going to read this whole quote to you, but it will be on the slides later for you to read. But it basically says that an institution's management should consider succession planning through appropriate succession and transition strategies for key staff members. And all of this is said in the context of limiting business disruptions due to staffing changes. And really, that's it. So the FFIEC doesn't say much more about this topic, but what we can infer from these references is that succession planning is an important part of business continuity planning. So it's a great idea to consider. Since the proposal of the succession planning rule, again, that started 3 years ago, the NCUA has also published 2 letters to credit unions that address the topic. The first was in March 2022, so this was like the month after it got proposed. And while this letter itself does not address succession planning, the CAMELS rating system now does. So under the management component, so that's the M in CAMELS, credit union examiners are to really think about the extent to which your credit unions are planning for succession in your key management positions. The second letter was in January 2023. So in the NCUA supervisory priorities, they really spelled out that they were planning to focus on succession during exams. So really their goal was to better understand the state of the industry. And I think that this has to be a factor in the ultimate releasing of this rule. So while neither of these really provides guidance on what succession planning looks like, I think they're important to note because it really shows that the NCUA has been focusing on this as a matter of importance for several years now. Rules don't just typically pop up out of thin air, and unfortunately for all of us, neither do succession plans. So all of this information tells us one thing. The NCUA really believes that succession planning is a good idea. The difference between the existing requirements and the new rule is that succession planning is now explicitly required for the purposes of long-term business continuity and stability. All right, we have a great question that came through. Karen, thank you for asking. She asked about what do you do when all of your department heads are about the same age? Then it becomes a financial factor due to training and paying double salaries for a period of time. And yes, that is a big factor. The rule talks about budget, and I am going to come around to that in just a little bit. So put a pin in that idea. We are going to talk about that. And speaking of, that's actually a really great segue. We're going to talk about the new requirements. So what are the new requirements exactly? I'm so glad you asked. For our purposes today, I'm going to break the categories or break the requirements down into 2 categories. The first is board requirements and the second is plan requirements. So hold on to your hats. We are about to dive into the weeds. And I'd love to kick things off with the board requirements. The rule states that the credit union's board of directors is ultimately responsible for establishing and approving the credit union's written succession plan. And along with that, the board is required to review and update the plan on a set schedule. Something interesting is that the rule assigns a bright line to this review process of no less than every 24 months. So just a little side soapbox here, grammar matters, and legally speaking, I think this choice of words is actually really fascinating because it's ambiguous. From a grammar perspective, referring to the plan as needing to be reviewed no less than every 24 months could be interpreted to mean that this event cannot happen sooner than every 24 months. That said, clearly this is not the intent of the rule. In the commentary on the rule, the NCUA actually says that the plan should be reviewed at least once every 24 months. And just to make sure I was providing accurate information to you all, I did go ahead and confirm this with one of our NCUA examiner friends. So your guess is as good as mine as to why they didn't use the at least once wording in the actual legalese part of the rule, because it is much clearer, but c'est la vie. And if you ever want to talk about grammar, I'm your girl, and Oxford commas save lives. I will stand by that. So let's get back into this. There are 2 additional requirements for the board of directors in this new rule. Within 6 months of joining the board of directors, all board members must have a working familiarity with the succession plan, and they must be able to ask substantive questions about the succession plan. So in other words, this really cannot be a set it and forget it kind of thing. This plan is something that the NCUA is going to expect your boards to have an intimate working knowledge of, which is very different from current expectations regarding succession planning. So if you are a board member, or if you work for a credit union and your boards are not in the loop on this, it would be good to start getting on the radar sooner rather than later, and preferably before January 1st. So let's shift gears now and talk about the plan requirements. According to the final rule, the succession plan must be tailored for each credit union's size, complexity, and risk. This is always great language to see because it allows for flexibility. If you work for a small, non-complex, low-risk credit union, you do not have to create the same type of succession plan as you would if you worked for a large, highly complex, significantly risky credit union. So yay for flexibility. Regardless of your size, complexity, and risk, though, your written succession plan must be designed to answer 3 questions. 1 is who should be part of your succession plan. 2 is when are you expecting to enact the plan, if you know. And then 3 is how are you going to implement the plan. So 3 really, really big questions, but let's go ahead and break these down. Before we get into it, I want to ask you, what positions do you include in your succession plan if you have one? Let me go ahead and launch that here. Our answer options are board members, management officials, senior executive officers, others. And if you choose others, go ahead and leave me a comment. Let me know who's in there. And then our last answer option is not applicable or unknown. And this one should be select all that apply. So feel free to choose multiples on this. All right, we've got about 60% voted, so I'll give you just a couple more seconds here. All right, I'm going to close that and share those results with you. 3/4 of us said senior executive officers, 52% said management officials, 36% said board members. One of our attendees commented and said only the CEO. So thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. And 12% said others. So that is really fascinating. We're kind of all over the place there. So this is a little bit interesting. I'm going to move on to the next slide, because when it comes to answering the question who, it should not really come as a surprise to you that the final rule lists all of those people, right? We've got board members, management officials, assistant management officials, senior executive officers, and this last one is actually really, really interesting to me. It says any other personnel the board deems critical. So that last bullet is very broad, very flexible, but it could include things like new positions that are created due to changes in strategic planning or changes in your supervisory landscape. It could also include specialized positions. So there's actually a really great quote in the commentary on the rule that says, and I'm just going to read this here. Without adequate planning, key operations could be impacted during management transitions or leadership vacuums, such as record keeping, lending, and other member services, liquidity management, cybersecurity, compliance with laws and regulations, and other critical responsibilities. So when we're talking about critical positions, there's a little bit of ambiguity here, but also some interesting insights. If you work in a small credit union with limited cybersecurity staff, this basically says that might be a position you want to factor into your succession planning process. There's a question that came through that said, what's the difference between a management official and senior executives? So I think that would really come down to semantics. The final rule did define those as two different categories, but you might have senior executives, vice presidents who are not management officials. So I think that's really what the distinction is. They just want to make sure that all of your key personnel are covered in this succession plan. So thank you for asking. That's a great question. You said critical is deemed by the board. Should this question be put to the board? Put to the board, yes, but informed by you, absolutely. Your board may not know what positions are critical, at least off the cuff. They may need some help from you in understanding what is a critical position for our credit union. So I think that that's something that the board is ultimately going to be responsible for, but also we have some responsibility in communicating that to our board, which again, we're going to come back to in just a little bit. So thank you for asking. That is a great question. Can a third-party vendor be part of the succession for staff? I'm going to say definitely maybe. You know, if you have outsourced a function, that's going to be something to consider in the succession planning process. Is your third party ready to step into that position when you need them? That's something that you would have to decide between you and that third party. But the rule does not prohibit the use of third parties as backups or as cross-trained personnel. And I think the more that we see outsourcing happen, the more that that's going to be a common thing that we're seeing, especially with consultants. I know, for example, at Conetrix, we have our Boost Consulting Group. They serve as the VISO for a lot of financial institutions. So yeah, I think the more that we outsource, third parties can definitely become a viable part of this conversation. So thank you for asking, Mike and Chad and Richard. I really appreciate the questions. Feel free to keep those coming. Stepping back in, now that we've talked about who, I want to talk about when. And this question is really about when are you expecting to enact the plan? The rule calls that these anticipated position vacancy dates. And there are a few types of position vacancy dates that the rule mentions, including the expiration of the current position holder's term, and that would be like for elected positions. There's also the current position holder's retirement eligibility date, and there's also any announced departure dates. For example, if someone has said, I'm leaving at this time, you know what those dates are. The rule is clear that sometimes you don't know this information, and that's okay. If you do know, this information can help guide your plan by letting you know how much time you're working with. But I do want to be really, really clear here. This is a bit of a sensitive topic. It's sensitive for the current position holders because, as I mentioned earlier, people find fulfillment in their jobs, and anticipated vacancy dates can sometimes feel like people are counting down until they leave. On the other hand, it's also sensitive for the entire credit union. If employees know a beloved leader is expected to leave, that creates instability, that creates uncertainty. It can decrease morale. It can create feelings that there's going to be a leadership vacuum, or it could even prompt employees to start looking for new opportunities if they think that the changes are going to impact their roles. So again, I really want to cushion this idea of anticipated vacancy dates. It is in the rule, but I encourage you to walk through it with caution. So I do have some suggestions for you, but generally speaking, I do think that this would be good to handle with care and definitely live in the freedom of that if known clause. The rule does say if known. So yeah, just be careful with that. The last question the plan needs to answer is how. How are you going to implement the plan? And specifically, there are 3 questions you're going to want to answer. How are you going to recruit suitable candidates for each of the positions? How are you going to fill vacancies when a current position becomes vacant? And then the third question is, how are you going to ensure that the selected candidates are able to successfully fulfill the requirements of the position and of the credit union? So those are really big questions, but this slide right here, this is like your money slide. This is the heart of why we do succession planning and why the NCUA has published this new rule, right? Because it's easy to say Spider-Man can fill in while Iron Man's on vacation. It's much harder to say who's going to fill Iron Man's shoes or suit once he's gone, right? I'm a little late to the party, but I've been on a massive Spider-Man kick lately, and I just watched No Way Home like last weekend, and my heart was not ready for that movie. But if you're looking for a good movie about the trauma associated with failing to plan for succession, get out your popcorn. That's a good one. So back to these three questions. I really don't have a silver bullet solution for you, but I do have some suggestions, which really feels like a good segue out of the rule requirements. What I want you to take away from this section about the requirements is that succession planning is about making sure the right people are in the right place when they are needed most. All right. That feels like a good place for a little bit of a brain break. I've given you guys a lot of information to be thinking about. So I want to take just a second to say, if you're enjoying this webinar, I would love for you to join us for the next one. So our next session is scheduled for Thursday, April 3rd at 2 p.m. Central Time on replacing the FFIEC Cybersecurity Assessment Tool, a guide to cybersecurity frameworks. So if you've been keeping up with the FFIEC, in August, they announced the sunset of the CAT, and in their statement, they encouraged financial institutions to consider one of 4 other frameworks. Now, there's a little bit of an asterisk on this for credit unions because the NCUA has said that they're going to continue to update and maintain the ASET, which is a voluntary framework based on the CAT. But if you're interested in knowing about what options other than the CAT are out there and how Tandem is responding to these changes, I would love for you to join us for that webinar. So you can register now at tandem.app/webinars. So now that we've covered what the rule requires, I want to spend some time talking about best practices for succession planning. The first thing I want to do here is clear up a common misconception that there's only one type of succession planning. And I already kind of introduced this idea with my Spider-Man example a few minutes ago. When you do succession planning, there are actually a few vastly different scenarios that you could be planning for. So the first is temporary succession planning. This is important for those planned or unplanned shorter term absences. So that would be things like medical leave, vacations, other temporary time away. But there is also permanent succession planning. And there are really 2 categories that fall under this umbrella. So first is emergency succession planning. Sometimes people call this crisis planning. And this is important for those times when you're dealing with an unexpected departure due to a whole bunch of reasons that we don't like to think or talk about. So that would be like death, scandal, crime, winning the lottery, and disappearing to live a life of luxury, those kinds of things. But there's also what I'm going to call controlled succession planning. And this is typically performed as part of strategic planning. This really revolves around deliberate or planned changes due to things like the end of a term. There's also going to be things like resignation, promotion, any time that the person currently in the role is willingly stepping out and leaves a vacancy that needs to be filled. Now, the NCUA is really honed in almost exclusively on this more controlled succession planning idea. But I do mention the others because I think for your succession plan to be effective and not just a tick in the compliance checkbox, it really needs to be ready for any and all of these scenarios. So each of these scenarios are important for business continuity and stability purposes. But if you start with controlled succession planning, the rest tend to typically fall into place. Now, before we get to the next item, I do want to ask one more poll question of you today. And that question is your succession plan officially documented somewhere? So yes, no, not applicable, unknown. And if you say yes, go ahead and leave me a comment. Tell me where you guys keep that. I would love to know. A couple questions coming through. Can you provide the address for signing up for the other webinar again, please? Yes, that is going to be tandem.app/webinars. So you can sign up there. We will also include a link to that in the slides, which another question that came through, can we get a copy of these slides? Absolutely. We will be sending out a copy of the slides after the session. All right, I'm going to close that and share those results. Okay, 76%, so 3/4 of us said yes, 7% said no, and 17% said unknown. So getting lots of good feedback here in our chat. So some interesting comments. We've got a couple that said in HR. A couple people said it's just, I love this one, it is just a policy. So yes, that is a good option. It's in our board portal, it's in our policy library. We keep it in Teams with copies in our personnel policies committee. Love that. What I really wanted to show you guys here is that there's not really one good place to keep your succession plan, right? We kind of keep it wherever works best for us, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. So thank you so much for sharing. I love to see that. So the reason that I bring this up is because the next common misconception that I really want to clear up is that your succession plan has to kind of be this giant, terrifying, all or nothing kind of document, right? This idea has caused some stress for people we've heard from because, as you can imagine, a succession plan can have some pretty confidential information in it. That being said, I really want to take us outside the compliance box for a minute because, truth be told, a succession plan isn't going to be a single standalone document. And that's true at least if you want it to be effective, right? And usable. So the best succession plans are going to be multi-layered. Let me walk you through an example to show you what I mean. Most of your succession plan and what most of you are commenting in is that it would be classified as private, right? It's a policy. So we would include basically on a need to know basis, we would share our sensitive succession plan policy information. We also have things like succession procedures, so our implementation steps, our cross-training plans, our emergency order of succession. So these kinds of things, again, they're private, and a great place for this kind of information would be in your organization's BCP. So more on that in just a minute. Okay, you remember when I had you put a pin in an idea a few minutes ago? This is where we're coming back to it. In a succession plan, there are some things that you would want to restrict. For example, if you've named specific successors for certain positions, if you have performance evaluations related to the plan, any job offers you've made, or meeting minutes related to succession planning, the kind of information that if it became generally available, it could create all of those legal issues, conflicts, instability. So yes, it's important to document this information, but this is an entirely different ballgame from the compliance documentation, right? This is business information. This is HR information. This is really sensitive information that we really want to restrict. So what I want to really do here is define the difference between these two things. So the private information is what's listed in the NCUA's rule. So it's good to have that information, but the rest is not included necessarily as part of whatever we're calling our succession plan. It's much better to keep that in a highly restricted system or network location. So I really wanted to kind of show the difference there between the compliance and the practical documentation. Now, there are also less classified parts of your succession plan you need to be thinking about. So to have a succession plan, you need to have potential successors or candidates. So because of that, things like your employee handbook likely have information related to succession planning that you may not even be aware of. So guidelines on taking a leave of absence, guidelines on career development, guidelines on what to do if your supervisor is unavailable, right? All of that is considered, internal or general access. There's also training or development programs. Those are a key part of your succession plan, but I hope you're publicizing those, right? You want people to learn, you want people to grow at your organization. And then there's also organization charts that demonstrate the structure of your credit union. And those org charts can really help you identify those key and critical positions. So if you're going to your board and you're trying to educate them on what's a key position, an org chart is a great way to show that. You can say, hey, see this person, they've got like 17 people that work with them, or this person is the only person that knows how to do this task. Those org charts can become a really valuable tool in helping you communicate the value of your succession plan. So I share that with you because I think we'd be missing part of the picture if we don't factor all of these things into our succession planning processes. All that being said, When it comes to succession planning, restrict what needs to be restricted, but don't be afraid to allow access to what needs to be accessed. The problem that the NCUA is trying to address is that let me clear this up. The problem that the NCUA is trying to address is not that there's too much succession planning information out there, it's that there's too little. And by the time you need it, it's often too late. Because of that, I personally think that the best place for you to manage your private succession plan details from a compliance perspective would be right inside your BCP. And here are 4 reasons for that. Reason number 1 is that your BCP already has similar policies of a sensitive nature. So your BCP likely already has compliance policies that outline specifics related to security controls, employee health and safety, and emergency authorizations. Having your policy level succession plan alongside all of these other similar policies help keeps it all together in one nice place with a nice little bow on it. Reason number 2 is that your BCP already contains relevant details for your succession plan. So your BCP should already document employee contact information, cross-training results, emergency decision-making authority, and perhaps most relevant of all, it may already have an order of succession that you've created for emergency purposes. So there is no place to start like the place you've already started. Reason number 3 is that your board already sees your BCP. Your BCP already goes to the board for approval. So as we discussed, your succession plan is going to have to be reviewed and approved by your board of directors on a regular basis. So why not make it easy on them and include it in a document that already goes to them for regular review and approval? I'm a big fan of the 2-for-1 deal, and I'm sure that they would be too. And reason number 4 is that your BCP is already designed to be available when you need it most. When you have a problem or a big organizational structural change, your BCP should be at the ready to guide you through whatever you're facing. And succession planning is no different. So, of course, everyone has their own unique flavor for succession planning, and that's totally okay. But if you are looking for the most bang for your buck, I really think you can't beat your BCP. Now, the last thing I want to mention is that succession planning is going to be really a multi-layered process that's going to involve a lot of people at your organization over an extended period of time. That said, if you are looking for a place to get started, this is where I would begin. Step 1 is to identify the key positions that you want or need to include in your succession plan. So I like this because odds are you're already thinking about them just by me saying that. That combined with the list we talked about earlier, you are going to know what these positions that are critical to your credit union success are. You just really need to make an inventory. Step 2 is to explore that inventory a little bit. Document what you know about each position. This could include things like the competencies and skills necessary to perform the job. So whoever's in this position, they do these things. And that helps you show why it's a critical position. It might also include things like instructions on what needs to happen to ensure a successful transition takes place. It might include that anticipated vacancy date, if you know it, or any anticipated or known expenses with filling the position. Things like training, things like incentives, things like salaries. So the more detail you can provide today, the more future you will be grateful. And so this kind of goes back to that question that we received earlier about budgeting, right? It's hard to budget today for an unknown. However, if you can start thinking about what does this position cost us right now and what is it going to cost us in the future, include that in your plan, include those considerations, document it. And even if it's an unknown, make a note about it because that way you can start thinking and exploring what can we do to address this in the future. Step 3, succession planning is a team sport. So for each of your key positions, you really need to have a selection committee of stakeholders. So that would include board members, that would include senior management, but it would also include HR, it would also include legal, and I argue it would also include the current position holders. Anytime you're dealing with people, it's important to give the right people a seat at the table. And lastly, planning now for long-term success. You may not be enacting your plan today. You might not be enacting your plan for another 10 years, but to be successful, you should start thinking about budgeting for training personnel. You should start thinking about retention practices so that your highly qualified candidates want to stay and work for your credit union long-term. You want to start thinking about appropriate communication so you can maintain stability and limit those potential disputes, and thorough documentation to demonstrate your efforts. Some questions coming through here. Love this. So, can you have only 2 stakeholders if you choose? Okay, I use the term stakeholders to describe people who have a vested interest in this process. I'm not necessarily meaning shareholders or anybody that's defined in your credit union bylaws. I mean people who have something to contribute, people who have a stake in this conversation. So that's a great question. Thank you so much for asking that, Babette. Can you give an example of what a selection committee would do? Yes. So the selection committee, their job would be to evaluate what do we need to do? You know, all those how questions we asked earlier. The selection committee's purpose would be to sit down and answer those how questions. How are we going to identify potential candidates for this position? How are we going to ensure that they are trained and ready to step into this role if and when we need them to be? So the selection committee is really, they are your one-stop shop decision point for how are we going to actually execute our succession plan. And I have a resource for this, so stick around. I'm going to show you guys towards the end of the session. So thank you, though, for asking, Stacy. Do you recommend stating only the position in the plan or also the employee/director's names? That's a good question, Kelly, and I'm going to say it really kind of depends. I think your policy level plan is going to just need a general understanding of the position. However, if you are getting to a point where you're actually having to talk about this in terms of names, that might be something to consider. That might be that differentiation between private and restricted information, right? Generally planning for certain positions, that's more private. You know, you're just generally speaking about your board members or your senior management. But if you were talking about Bob or Joe or Susan, you know, like we're talking about very specific people, that's more sensitive. That's going to require a little bit more care. So I'm going to say it really depends on where you're at in the process and what you're looking to in the future. So that's a really good question. Does the full plan need to be in place by January 2026? If you're working on a plan now but don't have it fully complete in 2026? Oh, that is a great question and a loaded one, Olivia. I'm going to say the rules effective date is January 1st, 2026. However, I think if you can demonstrate that you are actively working towards this, that's going to really help satisfy what your examiners are looking for. That's going to show that you are satisfying that management component in the CAMELS. You are actively working towards putting this in place. So I can't speak to that officially or legally, but I personally, if it was me, I would err on the side of grace if you can show your work. So I think that the fact that you are working on it now is excellent. And yeah, just be ready to explain and show your work, show where you're at. And I hope that that works out for you. Great questions. Thank you all so much for asking. Okay, so the final point that I want to make here, the last question that I want to answer is, once I've created my succession plan, how do I know if I have the right person for the job? And my short answer is going to be, you don't. You create the right person for the job, right? That's the whole reason we do succession planning. What you need right now is candidates who are authorized to step into a vacant role and candidates who are capable of stepping into a vacant role. Both of these are very nuanced things to navigate because convincing people to engage with succession planning can kind of feel like forcing people to write their own will. But if you want to ensure long-term success, you need current leaders who are willing to empower candidates, who are willing to be mentors, who are willing to help shape the future leaders of your credit union. And you need candidates who are passionate about your credit union's mission, your vision, your values, and who are willing to grow the skills needed to step into the leadership roles when they are needed, whether that's tomorrow or that's 10 years from now. So my final key takeaway for the day is this. Planning for succession is not just about filling roles. It's about carrying forward your vision. It's about communicating your values, and it's about ensuring stability. So if you can do this, you are well on your way to being safe and sound. So that is just about it. As we wrap up, I do want to provide you with a few takeaways and resources. And up first, I wanted to mention that along with the final rule, the NCUA has provided a succession plan template for small credit unions under 100 million in assets. So if you work for a larger credit union, you can still use this template to guide your succession planning processes, but just know it was designed for under 100 million. So the link to download this template will be in the slides, and I will ask our team to drop a link into the chat for you. As an alternative to using that PDF, as I mentioned early on, Tandem is a provider of business continuity planning software for credit unions. This is one of our most popular products, and it's used by hundreds of credit unions across the country. So if you, and I see a couple of questions coming through, if you currently use Tandem BCP, I am thrilled to let you know that we have features, we have templates already available to help you build your succession plan. So I'm going to take 2 quick minutes to show you where to find those. So let me open this up here. So just to mention, if you aren't familiar with Tandem Business Continuity Plan, it is a full suite of features and products that are designed to help you plan for your long-term continuity and resilience. So we've got things like a business impact analysis, we've got call trees, we've got an employee alerts tool, all kinds of things. But as far as the succession planning features go, the first thing I want to show you is that we have a new succession planning policy. So we added this I'm going to say a couple months ago, but it might have been longer than that because really this whole year is just flying by already for me. So this succession planning policy is ready for you to use today, right out of the box. Our HR team was involved in the development of this process. And basically, if you have the BCP product, this policy is here waiting for you to edit and make your own. So we have a description of the control. We have suggestions for implementation that are going to go through all of the things that the rule requires, including the hows. So we provide some suggested text for that. So I'd encourage you to check that out. We've also got some training terms. So how can you start mentoring and training future successors? So this is a really great resource that's included with the product. I'd encourage you to check it out, edit it, make it your own, but start with what we've provided. That's what it's there for. I also want to mention we have a cross-training matrix built into this. So your cross-training matrix is part of your succession plan. It's where you identify who is trained to perform the functions of these people. So this is a big part of your succession plan, along with the order of succession feature. So here you have the ability to answer all those questions and document for specific positions or even for specific people, whatever level you want to go to with this. You can identify successors and add comments. So you can talk about the anticipated vacancy date. You can go through those required competencies and skills, transition plans, budget and expenses, all of those kinds of things right here in your program. One of the things that the FFIEC IT exam handbook suggested was conducting exercises and tests to verify your succession plan works. So maybe you want to create a scenario around a incident involving your CISO. You can't get a hold of your CISO and you're having a ransomware attack. What are you going to do? That would be a great option to document to prove your succession plan works. And then when you are presenting this, you can either present your succession plan as part of your full BCP, or you can create a custom document. So here I've created one called succession plan, and it's got only those sections that I want to include. It's got the policy, it's got my order of succession, it's got my exercises and tests, it's got my phone list, all those things that I'm going to need to share with my board or communicate with my examiners that I have a succession plan. So what I really hope you see here is that Tandem BCP is ready to help you. So for our current customers that are using BCP, all of those features are available. So you are welcome to start using those today. And I'm going to go back to my slides here. If you work for a credit union and you don't have a business continuity planning software, I would love for you to become a Tandem customer. So our subscribers are the reason we get to offer free consulting webinars like this. So if you'd like to learn more about Tandem BCP or any of our products for that matter, please fill out the end of session survey when you leave today. Also, as a thank you for joining today, and because we want to be friends with you, I've been given permission to give you guys a free hoodie. So how cool is that? So if you want to get this sweet Tandem hoodie, and I definitely do, so if you don't want it, I'll take yours. Just kidding, Brian. Okay, so I've already mentioned it, but fill out our end of session survey when you leave today. So it's easy peasy. On the survey, you can request a demo of Tandem products, and I promise it's worth it. If you join the demo and see all of the Tandem magic happen, then you can score that free hoodie and live cozy. So if you want a free hoodie, and of course you do, because I do, we all do, feel free to sign up on the end of session survey. So we'll hope to see you there soon. All right, you guys are submitting a lot of questions, so I'm going to go back over and see those really quick. Question, is the succession policy available as a standalone and not attached to the BCP? No, that is part of our business continuity planning product, but if you have BCP, you can download it there and then put it in whatever system that you want. That succession plan policy is just part of that product, so thank you. Question about if the slides are going to be available. Yes, we will be making those available, so keep an eye on your email inbox. Let's see. Crystal, you have a really good comment here, so I'm just going to read this. I would add that if you are relying on the fact that you are in process or planning, that documenting meetings, planning timeframe, et cetera, would probably go a long way to speaking to the fact that you are in the process and maybe help satisfy an examiner if a plan is not finalized. That is 100% such good advice. Like that is what I was meaning by show your work, but I did not say it as eloquently as Crystal did. So thank you so much for that comment. I really appreciate it. A question from a bank, although we're speaking on the NCUA ruling, how does this apply to banks? Are they being judged on a similar or more rigorous standard? And no, the answer is not right now. The banks do not have anything equivalent. So there are some rules for very large banks out there from the Federal Reserve and OCC, but nothing right now for small community banks. So stay tuned. I'm sure there may be something in the works though. Best practice examples on how to identify or develop a source for new board members. So that is a great question, and that really leans into board training. How are you communicating this to them? So again, we'll be providing the slides, so you're welcome to share with them some of the resources that we've shared with you today. But I would really encourage them to start getting familiar, one, with your organizational structure. What are your critical positions? And start planning for how would you fill those positions if they became vacant. So those are really the two questions that you're wanting to answer. So that section that we covered on the who, the when, and the how, that is really what your board needs to know about. And they need to have a working familiarity with that within 6 months of joining the board of directors. So I think just making sure that they're aware, providing some resources to them, that would be step one. And I'll say this is something that NCUA is focusing on. So don't be afraid to leverage your examiner. Feel free to use any resources that the NCUA provides to help communicate about this as well. So thank you all. So many good questions coming through today. I really appreciate you joining, and I hope that this has been helpful for you. So on that note, I think we are going to call it a day. Again, thank you so much for joining us. I hope this has been very helpful, and I hope to see you next time. So we'll be back here, I'll say same time, same place. Just kidding. It's going to be, I believe, April. I don't have that date in front of me, but tandem.app/webinars. Join us for our next webinar. So thank you all again, and I hope you have a wonderful day.